What about bullies?
Perpetrators always feel that they're a victim first. I had a bad day in a circumstance in which I was powerless. And now I'm coming home and I need to get that out of me. Apply that to bullying or even mass shooting, and you get the same experience.
Dr. James Kimmel Jr. He is a lecturer in psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine, the founder and co-creator of the Yale Collaborative for Motive Control Studies, and the developer of the behavioral addiction model of violence. He researches violence prevention, motive control, revenge cravings, justice addiction, non-justice studies, and mental health peer support services. He takes a very, very interesting approach to an important topic of violence. He created SavingCain.org, which is an effort to save lives by offering support, resources, and compassion, not to the victims, which of course he has all of those feelings for victims and survivors, but to those considering murder, terrorism, mass shootings. And that is so important because prevention is so important. So I said those considering this, and there are places to go for help. This empathetic guest had the foresight to offer support to assist people that are contemplating revenge or other tragic decisions. And to me, that is very fascinating. You had an interesting life experience. I wish you would share that with people, because I think we have different points in our lives that are moments where we come to a precipice and we have to make decisions that become life-altering. And you talk about a time in your final years of high school when you say you were being bullied and some classmates, it just infuriates me to even think about this, but they snuck onto your property and shot your beagle, Paula, and the police didn't do anything. Talk about your experience when that happened, because I think that set you on this path.
Oh, there's no doubt that it did, in fact, set me on this path. It changed my life. I had two really big pivot points in my life, and that was the first one, Dr. Phil. And just as you said, I had been being harassed and bullied for several years through high school. I grew up in the country in central Pennsylvania on a farm, and by the time these kids were essentially my neighbors, other farm kids out in the country. But I wasn't a legitimate farm kid in the sense that my dad was an insurance agent. We lived on my great-grandfather's farm. So I wasn't accepted into the in-group there. And I desperately wanted to be part of that in-group. I wanted to be a farmer. That's my number one career goal when I was in high school, was to be a farmer, until I was so firmly rejected by these guys, which was a painful, painful experience. But it culminated one night while we were all home asleep in this, along this one-lane country road, just sort of half awake, and I hear a pickup truck coming down the road and stopping in front of our house, which is an unusual act in its own right, but it was enough to just grab my attention. And I looked out the window and I could see it was one of their trucks. And moments later, there was a gunshot. This woke everyone up. The person that fired the gun ran back, got in the truck, and they took off down the road. We looked around the house to see if there was any damage, bullet holes, anybody was hurt. No one was hurt. Went back to bed eventually. One of my jobs on our farm, it was a pretty small operation in terms, because we weren't making our living from it. So we had a herd of Angus cattle and some hogs and chickens, and one of my jobs before going into school in the morning and getting on that bus was to go out and feed the animals and water them and take care of our dog, our hunting dog, Paula, the beagle. And when I went up to her pen, I found her laying dead in a pool of blood with a bullet hole in her head, which was just the most, as you can imagine, the most shocking experience to imagine. I mean, obviously humans experienced far worse violence than that, human on human violence. Some terrible things occur. But when you're living in the country and you walk upon something like that, it shakes you. And I can tell you now, in hindsight, as a researcher, that exploded in my mind a desire to retaliate against these guys. I wanted justice, and I wanted it absolutely desperately. And nothing was going to stop me from getting it. Well, my parents called the state police. They came. These were in the days of things like this, and bullying and stuff between kids didn't really matter very much, not at that level. And this was well before school shootings had ever occurred. And it was ignored. And 2 weeks later, I was home by myself again, but pretty late at night. And they came back. The pickup truck came. And there was, I looked out the window after an enormous, for me, explosion, where they had blew our mailbox off its post, with like a half stick of dynamite. Crazy stuff. I mean, just you wonder why, right? Yeah. Well, anyway, that was it for me, and my justice craving was now unleashed. And I'd grown up with guns all my life. We had plenty of hunting weapons in our house, and my dad had a handgun in his nightstand, and I grabbed it and I ran out the door, and I took off after these guys. Took me a good bit of time to catch up to them. I was probably hitting nearly 100 miles an hour on this country road, and I chased them onto one of their farms, and I cornered them by a barn. And I had my high beams on them, and there were three of them, three heads in the rear window of a pickup truck, and they got out and just sort of stared back at me, dumbfounded like deer, kind of, who's this? Because it took me a while, so they wouldn't necessarily know who it was. They had no weapon. They didn't know I had one. And it was my opportunity to get justice. And I reached down and I grabbed that gun, and I unlocked the door and I started opening it. And thank God, at the very last second, I just had this sort of illumined moment, this sudden awakening that if I killed those three guys, and it would have been so easy, I'd have killed me, the guy that I knew I was for those 17 years. And I'd never come back from that. And I might be killed physically. I sure would be killed in my identity and my personality. I'd never be the same. I would be a murderer the rest of my life. And it was just enough of an insight to cause me to put the gun back down on that passenger seat and close the door and drive home. And that's when I decided to become a lawyer. Because, lawyers get justice for free, Dr. Phil, in America, or we think we do. We get justice without paying for it, or that's the message. And, we can go from there, but that's my little journey at that point.
What do you think caused you to take that pause when you did? Because it can be 2 seconds between opening that car door and pulling that trigger. A lot had to happen in that few seconds.
I'm a spiritual guy. I was raised, my grandfather was a Brethren pastor, and I was raised, it wasn't even raised. I've always felt like I had a pretty close relationship with the divine. And for me, I felt like that was a divine moment, an intervening moment. I'm not saying that, God intervened and saved my life, but I'm saying that my spiritual connection to God was reawakened at that moment, at the last second. And I can't explain exactly what caused that awakening, other than to say that all of my years I was raised in a good family. I was raised with a lot of advantages. I didn't have a lot of want. I didn't see a lot of violence. Violence wasn't who my family were, or my teachers. And those things, I think, helped support me in that crisis moment and helped be available. They were available for me to draw upon, at that last second. I often think about, there's a fellow that I work, actually there's several murderers, incarcerated that I work with, and they all seem like the other James Kimmel to me. Some of them are my age right now, and they've been serving 50-year sentences plus, and they had almost identical experiences. They didn't have a dog shot, but they had some other heavy grievance that they had experienced, some form of victimization that was completely shattering for them. And at the last second, they didn't have that illumination. And it is boggling to me, and it's tragic to me, that so many people don't have those built-in resources, whatever they are, or that sense of spirituality that's critical, to be able to stop. But I'll say even people that have all those resources, they sometimes go right through the red light and they commit that act of violence. And that's why, the new book that I'm writing, which is called The Justice Addicted Brain, The Surprising Science for How Good People Turn Deadly. That's kind of my message, is that people think of murderers typically as sociopaths, psychopaths, people with broken brains, people that are demented, filled with evilness. It's rarely the case, actually. That's true. There is a group of people who have sociopathology that's diagnosable, and if you study their brains are different from the rest of us. But that represents 1% to 3% of the population. Most of the violence is not being perpetrated by sociopaths in our world. It's being perpetrated by good people who have a grievance and get caught up in this addictive process. And by the time they've gratified this craving for revenge, and you get high from it. If I would have pulled the trigger, I'd have been as high as a kite for minutes to maybe even an hour after. But after that, I'd have crashed hard the way all drug addicts do. And I would have been left hurting even more than I was before, and yet somehow wanting more of this drug over and over again. It's the most powerful and dangerous addiction in humanity, far more dangerous than drug addiction, because the only way to get high for a justice addict is to inflict suffering upon somebody else. A justice addict uses a gun to inject a bullet. A drug addict uses a syringe to inject a drug. But in the end, these are two processes of making yourself feel better when you're hurt.
On Oops, the podcast, join me, comedian Giulio Gallerati, as I examine everyday life, the mistakes, the bad decisions, the goals, the jokes, the social engagements, and all things in between. I'm joined every week by producer and personal confidant Ryan Lynch, various other comedians, for witty, candid, and intoxicating conversation. Our listeners love Oops for its sophisticated banter, aka your mom could listen, and many feel like they're in the room with us chopping it up with old pals. You can find every episode of this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube.
Almost half of school shootings are over in the first few minutes. We need to prevent it before it happens. Let's take a look at what happened in Uvalde. Just threats in the first month of the school year. They identified 151 threats compared to a 3-year average of 29. This has to be analyzed. It has to be thought about. And actual shootings doubled from the previous year at 55, up from 24. We need to not be thinking, how can we keep doing the same thing? We need to be thinking about, how can we do something different? So the question is always, well, all right, let's identify the profile. Who's doing this shooting? Sadly, I can tell you there is no profile, and we don't have the psychological tools to identify who's going to be a shooter. But there are some commonalities. There are some indicators, and I'm going to share with you what some of those are. These are often current or former students of the school they go to shoot up. It's not always the case, and they are often in some type of mental, emotional, or social crisis. Being bullied was common. Now, do they go back and shoot the bully? Occasionally, but typically that's not the case. Shooters go and aggress not against their transgressors, but against surrogates. They go shoot against somebody that's just a stand-in. They just go shoot somebody that is available, somebody that they aren't threatened by. These are people that have experienced observable, now I want to emphasize observable, mental health symptoms in 3 main categories: psychological, behavioral, and neurological. I'm emphasizing observable because people notice that they're behaving unusually. About half of them have received one or more mental health services. So they've come to the attention of mental health providers. So they're not completely in the dark and about these people. They are on somebody's radar. Most typically, it's depression or suicidal ideation. Some have anxiety. A much smaller percentage than you would think present with anger. They're depressed. They've been shunned by society. They've been through some type of rejection experience. And our number one need is acceptance. Our number one fear is rejection. And they've had some trauma in that regard. They very frequently have negative home life factors such as divorce, drug use, someone in the family, a mother or father, have criminal charges, and domestic violence is common. So they exhibit these concerning behaviors, and that contradicts the myth that, oh, it's the nicest guy, it's the last person I would have ever thought of. That's not true. And here's a very troubling element. They're often the product of the contagion effect. Now, what do I mean by that? They're inspired by other school shooters. I say that's particularly troubling because when you see what happened in Uvalde, that predicts that it's very likely that there's going to be a repeat of this in the future. Someone out there that is really desperate, really tragic, is going to see what has happened here, and they're going to become obsessed with it, and they're going to react to it. Maybe in a week, maybe in a month, who knows? And one of the most confounding things about this is they often tell others what they're going to do before they do it. We covered another shocking school shooting that happened just days after Thanksgiving. On November 28, 2021, 15-year-old Ethan Crumley walked into Oxford High School in a Detroit suburb and shot and killed 4 students. Some students actually stayed home because they said they knew what was going to happen and they didn't feel safe going to school. Now, this crime not only stood out at the time as being the deadliest school shooting since Parkland, but for being the first where a shooter's parents have been charged with crimes linked to the shooting.
They basically gave him a license and permission to kill. Did they know the gun was in the backpack? Did they know the plan, what he was going to carry out? Why not bring him home if there's trouble?
Isn't their job to know where the gun is? If the gun is missing from home and their child is being called in at school and he's drawing pictures of bullets and blood, and they say, "Where's our gun?" and he was shooting it the day before, isn't it endemic upon a parent to say, "Wait a minute, this isn't a coincidence"? And we also heard about what happened from Oakland County Sheriff Michael Bouchard. Sheriff, when you find out about this, in this case and in most cases, you intervene once something happens, right?
The school district officials did interview the subject the day before and the day of the tragedy, and we were never brought into those meetings. And that would have triggered the protocols that we have in place. And that is that if there's concerning behavior, the first thing we do is determine if there's a threat immediately. I'm sad to say, we sit here today, we've had more threats today. If you make a threat, even if it's not real, if you think it's a joke, it's not. If you have no intention of carrying out a threat, it's still a crime.
The shooter charged through the doors of Uvalde's Robb Elementary School, opening fire just after 11:30. Armed, law enforcement says, with an AR-15 assault rifle, high-capacity magazines, and a handgun.
And we have learned that the gunman legally purchased 2 assault rifles and almost 400 rounds of ammunition earlier this month for his 18th birthday.
Another very powerful weapon. And by the way, these weapons are very expensive. I think in this case, there were reports that the gun cost close to $1,800. And you have to ask yourself, where does this kid get money for an $1,800 assault rifle? When you talk to the family, the grandfather says he knew nothing about it.
Could you give us any insight into his
Not
state
really.
of mind? When's the last time you spoke to him?
I speak to him daily.
You know he had guns in the house? No?
I didn't know. I get up at 5 o'clock, leave, come back.
He didn't know that the child had this. And I'm sorry, but if you have a child that's building up an arsenal, it's your job to know. You need to know what your child is spending money on and where they're getting that kind of money. There were 2 rifles apparently bought in the Uvalde shooting. We don't want to focus on just statistics and firearms and weapons and forget what's on the other end of that rifle. What's on the other end of this tragedy? It may just seem like, firearms and guns and violence. But let's not forget the humanity. Some of the children, and we are talking children here, 9, 10-year-old children in Uvalde. One of them speaking to a local news outlet, KENS5, in Texas, said, "When I heard the shooting through the door, I told my friend to hide under something so he won't find us." He said, and I quote, "I was hiding hard, and I was telling my friend not to talk because he's going to hear us." The boy shared heartbreaking details about what happened in that room. He said, and I quote, "When the cops came, the cop said, 'Yell if you need help.' And one of the persons in my class said, 'Help!' The guy overheard, and he came and shot her," the boy said. The cop barged into that classroom, and the guy shot at the cop, and the cop started shooting. He said that once the shooting stopped, he came out from under the table. "I got out with my friend. I knew it was police because I saw the armor and the shield." It's a 10-year-old child. It's just absolutely heartbreaking. Now, the big question that you have to be asking yourself right now is, if what we've been talking about is true, and it is, you can study this for years, as I have, and you're going to find that these people are likely to tell somebody what they're going to do. They're actually very likely to be known to the system. So if they tend to have what's called leakage, meaning that they post a manifesto or they put things on the internet or they tell people what they're going to do, you think, then how are we not stopping this? Dr. Phil here. Come February 27th, you're going to be able to pick up a book called We've Got Issues. And you know we do. This is a book that says it's going to teach you how to stand strong for America's soul and sanity. And in this book, I set forth 10 principles for saving this society from going off the deep end. 10 principles for protecting your family. 10 principles for giving you what you need to flourish and have the life that you want for yourself and for your children and for your grandchildren. We've taken some wrong turns. We've been letting the loudest voices dictate some of the thinking that has taken us way off course. Well, I'm speaking up and bringing us back to the center of the road. I hope you'll pick this book up, and I hope you'll read it with a real open mind, because I'm pushing back against a lot of what you've been hearing. Somebody had to do it. Might as well be me. February 27th, We've Got Issues. Psychologist Dr. Jillian Peterson and sociologist Dr. James Dinsley of the Violence Project have developed an integrated, interdisciplinary understanding of violence and a holistic approach to addressing it. You use the term mind shift, and it seems like there has to be 2 mind shifts. I'm curious how y'all feel about this. One is, like you say, we used to think about predators as the guy that showed up outside the fence at the schoolyard in the raincoat and saying, "Hey, kid, would you like some candy?" Now we realize that 95% of them are known to their victims, And now we know they're on the internet and they're a completely different breed of cat. So we've got to get them to realize this may have been the kid that was in the lunchroom or sitting next to me in the back of the class yesterday, and he didn't have horns. He didn't look all dark. Well, he probably looked dark, but didn't have horns. So we've got to get that mind shift. But then the other mind shift is that telling is not tattling.
Right.
They've got this idea that snitches get stitches, and we've got to get them to realize that they're helping. If they can get this information to the right person at the right time, they may be saving this kid's life, because this is A, suicide mission, B, he's in pain, and C, terribly lonely, marginalized, and desperate for some kind of relief. This is a helping thing, not something punitive.
And that's actually the first step in the true intervention, which is we've got to train everybody in the school building. And I mean everybody, the person on the front desk, the teachers, the principal, and the students and the parents, so that if you see something, you say something. And everybody's on that same page of knowing that you're doing this because you're trying to help somebody. And not only are you trying to help somebody because you're trying to prevent a school shooting, but in doing so, you might also be preventing a suicide, or you might be preventing a student who's being bullied and is feeling lonely and isolated and everything that you just described. So there's this really huge diffusion of benefits for doing this. And it really comes down to, we've got to make sure everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet on this, and we're all on the same page, and we're all in it together. So we can train everybody in this. We talk about crisis intervention as like CPR. It can save a life, and it's something that everybody can be educated in and can practice. And I think that's the mind shift right there to use.
To me, that makes so much sense. We need to train cafeteria workers, janitors, coaches, teachers, teachers' aides, administrators, local police officers, parents, everybody. And then there's got to be somewhere for them to go, particularly the students, because, like I said, if we've got 300 or 400 students in a high school, that's 300 or 400 sets of eyes. A school counselor's not going to see this the way the kids are going to see it. They can see it sitting back there in geometry. They can see it in gym. They can see it in the lunchroom. But they've got to have somewhere that they can anonymously report this so they don't feel like they're putting themselves in jeopardy. Because if they're wrong, and most of the time they probably will be, but they've only got to be right occasionally to save lives. But right or wrong, they've got to know that they can do this anonymously, and then it's going to be acted on. And I can tell you, in my experience with these kids that get really dark, whether it's a coach or a teacher or somebody that can just step up one time and put their arm around their shoulder and say, "Hey, man, take a walk with me. Let's go talk. I'd like to know what's going on, and I've looked at your records and I see you're falling behind. We can work this out. It's okay. I understand you broke up with this girlfriend or whatever, but I'd like you to help me in the office after school or something for a while." Anything that makes them feel like there's a reason to get up tomorrow, and then they can contact the parents and find out if all these other things, the early childhood trauma that's unresolved, what was the crisis point? What do you find out about the family dynamic once you find out what's going on in the home?
You know, we see a few different things. Oftentimes you find that the family itself is really chaotic and in crisis. There might be domestic violence in the home or financial struggles, and the boy is not getting kind of the attention and resources that he needs at home. Once in a while, you'll see a parent who maybe does see some of the warning signs and almost kind of amplifies the risk. So does things like is then taking them to shooting ranges and buying them guns and not monitoring social media, where it's, almost sort of next level in terms of pushing them further down that pathway. So we see both of those things.
Where are most of the shooters getting their guns?
They take them from their parents or their grandparents or their family members. They're not old enough to buy them, so they're taking unsecured firearms from homes.
Let's say we did everything that we're talking about here. Let's say that we were able to get the protocol folded into teacher, staff, student training. They were willing to make time in teacher training, student training. There was a protocol put together to give them the idea that there was a number to call, that there was somebody on the other end that knew what to do, that there was an intervention strategy, there was a step 2, 3, and 4 if this was reported. And then there was a massive campaign to lock up the guns, just like the Just Say No campaign from Nancy Reagan. Massive campaign to lock up the guns. So the kid couldn't get the guns as readily from home or grandma's house or whatever. How much of an impact could we have here? If we trained everybody and locked up the guns, how much of an impact could we have?
I think it could really be a game changer. And again, it's not just because you're trying to prevent a school shooting, but doing that could also prevent an accidental shooting in the home where a child finds a gun and accidentally uses it against a family member. It could prevent suicide in the home. It could prevent domestic violence in the home. So again, you get this ripple effect that sometimes that messaging can have this broader impact than you really can ever appreciate. But in the case of these school shootings, it's unequivocal that these shooters are getting firearms from the home. And the more we can do to send the message that safe storage saves lives could truly be a game changer. And so I think a public health campaign around that is also something that is not really that controversial. Whenever you talk about firearm policy, it often gets stuck because it's such a divisive issue. This is something I think everybody can agree on. Everybody can say, we want to be responsible gun owners. And the way we do that is if we've got children, if we've got teenagers in the home, we store our firearms safely. And it's something to be proud of if we do that.
I work with a lot of exonerees from death row and prison, but the ones that death row, where the stakes are so high, impact me so greatly. And one of these gentlemen recently that spent over 30 years on death row for a crime he did not commit, DNA completely exonerated him. And then all of a sudden, his alibi of not even being in the state at the time seemed to make a lot more sense. Someone asked him, how are you not bitter? How are you not just so angry that they did this to you? And without even thinking, he said, you know what? That's why the rear view mirror is this big and the windshield is this big. He said, they took 32 years. I'm not giving them another minute by living in the past. It's all forward. It's all in front of me right now. I don't have time to carry a grudge and be upset about what's happened in the past. Maybe I should, maybe it makes sense, but I don't have another minute to waste. I'm all looking forward at this point. And all of these guys, and they're all guys because there are so few women on death row, all of these guys have such a spirit about them. Those that are still on death row that know they're innocent. There's a man on death row in Oklahoma right now that I am so committed to getting exonerated. His name's Richard Glossop. He didn't commit the crime any more than I did. And he's had his last supper 3 times. And every time he has shared it with the guards. I asked him, what do you mean? He said, look, they're just doing their job. They're not doing anything wrong. And let me tell you, I don't want to eat alone. So he shares this meal with the guards, and 3 times they've gone down there and either had a last-minute reprieve. Once they were going to execute him, and they had the wrong drugs. So they said, hey, we screwed up. You got to go back. Then they suspended executions in Oklahoma for a number of years, so he sat there waiting again. Now he's on the list again, and we're working hard to get him off of it. But his attitude is, hey, I know I didn't do it. These guards, I think they know I didn't do it, but it's not their decision. And he doesn't have this revenge loop in his head. He's chosen to forgive everybody involved and just believes that the right thing's going to happen. He's going to walk out someday. It's his choice. He has set himself free, even though he's in a cage.
That's remarkable and again miraculous, right? I mean, that's the stuff of miracles, when you can be on death row and still set yourself free from the inside. And knowing this now, what we've just described, you know it so well, you've seen it in other people. We have to ask ourselves as humans, so why don't, if it's so wonderful an experience, why don't we do it more? Why do we withhold forgiveness from ourselves as victims? Why do we withhold this from ourselves as a society and disparage forgiveness as something that the weak people do, or that only a certain select elite person like a Gandhi or a King or a Jesus would do? These aren't truth statements that anybody can do it. But why is it that we can't? And now we have a scientific explanation for that. It's this addiction. It's this craving. Your brain is so hijacked by the grievance, and it sets in motion these 2 areas of your brain, the dorsal striatum and the nucleus accumbens. And when these 2 areas of your brain activate, they're the same areas that activate for narcotics or chocolate, if that's your thing, or sex, whatever, different powerful cravings. When those things activate, you're driven, you're strongly motivated to seek revenge for pleasure. And what we know is that's the same way with a drug. You seek the drug for pleasure. Yes, you'll get a little bit of pleasure for a short period of time, and then it'll destroy you. It'll leave you in more pain than you were. The same process is at work here.
Then you need another fix. I don't want people to gloss over when we throw big words around, but nucleus accumbens, we're talking about the pleasure center. This is how your brain feels pleasure. That's how you experience pleasure. And it can get hijacked by things that are not healthy for you to feel pleasure about. You feel pleasure when your child says mama or dada for the first time, or when your team wins, or something happens that's healthy and constructive. But it can also get hijacked by drugs or revenge or things that aren't healthy for you. And that's what you're talking about here. I think part of it too is people think that they're being pansies if they don't stand up for themselves and fight back and get even. If you had gotten even that night when you had those morons pinned against a barn, I just have a problem with people being cruel to animals. But had you stood up for yourself and been macho that night, we very likely would not be talking right now.
Well, you might be talking to me on death row.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where you might be interacting with me right now, and that would be a real tragedy. And that's exactly right. This desire for, we really are up against it in American society, where the glorification of revenge seeking at the social networking level, on media, movies, superhero movies are designed to trigger your revenge craving. They give you a grievance at the beginning. Many movies do. You get a grievance and they activate in the audience the desire for retaliation. They string that out for about an hour and 20 minutes or so. And then you finally get your fix. Your fist is clenched. Finally, the villain got his. You're out the door and they want to bring you back again, and you know where the fix is and you know how to get it. So it happens in video games. It happens in movies. And there's been a lot of discussion about, do violent video games cause violence? It's not the violence in the video game that's risky. It's the stimulation of the revenge craving that's risky. The more often you take any drug, the more you're conditioned to it, the more you want it, and the more higher quality and higher quantity of that drug you want. And so the risk isn't just that it isn't the portrayal of violent imagery that is will drive somebody to commit an act of violence. It is, though, this conditioning of an individual who finally gets a real grievance in their head to go, I know what made me feel good in those video games. It's a small step now between that and a real handgun or a rifle or something else. So we cling, and we want that craving fulfilled, and we don't want to give it up. If you talk to a heroin addict and say, hey, sir, how about why don't you just do the right thing here and stop taking heroin? They're not going to do it. They're addicted. That's the whole problem with it. So to expect somebody that has a powerful justice addiction or revenge addiction to just give that up, even though you could show that through forgiveness they will truly experience freedom, is a tough ask. And that's why we're now developing these interventions that make forgiveness easier and help this, as I was saying, methadone for a justice addict, allow them to experience a safer form of this revenge in order to get them beyond it, to start thinking clearly again. And this applies, as you said, Dr. Phil, to any form of grievance. It's not just about violence. It's anything in your life, any family member, friend, employer, the person at the checkout counter, the person at the gas pump. It just applies everywhere.